Dawn Fowler was a perfect fit for her conservative Southern community.
She was this godly woman.
I went to First Baptist Church every Sunday.
She had even reconciled with her ex-husband, Richard.
They couldn't live without each other.
And she was nursing him back to health after a debilitating injury.
He had asked Dawn to take care of me, and she said she would.
But then came a shocking crime.
From 911 to address your emergency.
Blood was everywhere.
He had just been brutally beaten to death.
It was one of the most brutal crime scenes I had ever seen.
One that would leave the investigators wondering, was it a random act of God?
It sounds like a home invasion robbery type thing is what it sounds like.
Or did this godly woman have some sinful secrets?
We're in the Bible Belt. This just does not happen here.
Didn't I kill once? No, I did not.
Spartanburg, South Carolina, December 13th, 2006. It was around 8 a.m. in this town of 40,000, 3 hours northwest of Charleston, in the area known as the South Carolina Piedmont.
It's considered the upstate of South Carolina.
It's a beautiful place. It's a southern place. Everybody here is respectful. It's yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir, no sir.
It was a good place to raise a family. I mean, not much goes on there.
But that morning, something was going on in the suburbs north of town.
From 911 to address your emergency.
I just took my kids to school and came home. Carport door had been wide open. The screen door was open.
The caller was 37-year-old Dawn Fowler.
She had not went inside the residence and felt that something was strange and odd due to the fact that the door was left open.
Basically called in thinking a burglary had occurred.
The 911 operator immediately dispatched sheriff's deputies to the scene.
Home invasion robbery type thing is what it sounds like.
The deputies arrived on the scene prepared to search for a burglar.
Officers got there, cleared the house.
But there was no sign of a burglar. And inside the house, as the deputies moved from room to room, they found nothing amiss. Until they arrived at the bedroom, where 34-year-old Richard Fowler was sprawled in his bed.
Route 4, roll me EMS.
10-4, how do you want us to code it?
Severe injury to the head. I can't tell you what right now.
Blood was everywhere.
The walls, up on the ceiling fan.
It's just, we got quite a thing.
And that scene was clearly not a burglary. Sheriff's deputies suddenly had a murder on their hands.
He had just been brutally beaten to death.
It was one of the most brutal crime scenes I had ever seen.
But was Richard's death really a brutal home invasion? Or did the bloody scene mask a scandalous secret that would land Dawn in the middle of a murder investigation? Born in 1969, Dawn spent her early years in North Carolina. But when she was 9, Dawn and her family moved just over the state line to the tiny town of Chesney, South Carolina, where she was active in the church and sang in the children's choir.
Dawn grew up in Chesney, and then as a teenager, they moved down to Spartanburg.
But once in Spartanburg, her parents divorced, and Dawn stayed with her mother while she finished high school. And they'd barely settled into their new neighborhood before a boy down the street caught her eye. 3 years younger than Dawn, Richard Fowler was a typical small-town Southern boy.
He played football. He loved baseball, any type of sports, loved hunting, fishing, was very outdoorsy.
He's a laid-back fella, smiling and happy.
And despite the difference in their ages, Dawn was immediately attracted to the easygoing teenager.
Dawn was always after him, wanting to be his girlfriend.
Not that Richard was all that interested, at least not at first.
When Dawn and Richard first met, he had a girlfriend.
But then, when that relationship ended,
Dawn jumped in once he broke up with the other girl.
Despite the difference in their ages, the couple started going out, and they continued to date even after Dawn graduated and got a job at a local restaurant.
She was breakfast biscuit maker.
And in 1989, when Richard was a senior in high school, Dawn got pregnant.
She grew up with divorced parents, and I think she wanted a family. And sometimes I think that's why she got pregnant so young.
Richard dropped out of school and got a fast food job to help support the baby.
They both worked for Hardee's. Richard was like an assistant manager.
Dawn and Richard also married.
A couple months after they were married, they had their first daughter.
The couple's early years were tough.
They struggled. They had hard times.
Neither Dawn nor Richard's parents supported them.
Her mother didn't want Richard living with them, and, my parents was upset that he didn't finish school. So I took him in. So they lived with me for a couple years.
Although even with his sister's help, money was tight as the couple entered their 20s.
They struggled financially.
And their struggle got even harder when at the age of 6 months, their daughter was diagnosed with epilepsy.
She started developing seizures. She was really sick for a long time.
Still, things did eventually get better for the couple. Richard and Dawn were able to afford a place of their own and move out of his sister's house. And they soon expanded their family with 2 more daughters, a second in 1992 and the youngest in 1998. And by then, Richard had moved on to a better, higher-paying job.
He worked for a company called Exopac, box manufacturing plant.
He was a machine operator. He also got a second job to help him out, doing newspapers. And she just continued with her little part-time job at Hardee's.
However, raising 3 kids and juggling multiple jobs in order to get by put considerable strain on the couple's nearly 10-year marriage.
They would have their fights and split up and still end up back together.
But then, in 2001, Dawn did something inexcusable.
She fooled around on him.
He was devastated. They ended up getting a divorce.
He moved back in with his parents, my grandparents.
However, despite Dawn's infidelity, the separation didn't last. And in less than a year,
Richard's mother passed, and that was when they got back together.
Dawn was there for her ex-husband when he needed her most.
He was a mama's boy, and he took it very hard. And they moved back in together.
They couldn't live without each other.
Richard forgave Dawn.
People make mistakes. Give them the benefit of the doubt.
And Dawn told her sister-in-law that she regretted the affair.
She told my wife that she wished she had never done the things that she had done.
They never remarried, but that didn't seem to matter.
Couples go through their issues and reconcile all the time. They seemed like they were doing a good job of that. They seemed happy-go-lucky at the time, seemed like a good couple.
Over the next several years, they settled into what appeared to be a quiet, middle-class life.
He was working a lot of overtime, trying to make money for the family.
Enough that Dawn was able to quit working.
Dawn was basically a housewife.
Her day focused on 2 things, her kids, and like most everyone else in Spartanburg, her church.
This is your Bible Belt, kind of place where you go to church on Sunday, very Southern.
Dawn went to First Baptist Church. She went every Sunday.
And her brief affair was apparently well behind her.
She had changed. She was this godly woman.
However, just as Dawn and Richard appeared to have put hard times behind them, their relationship would be put to the test once again. The trouble started when Richard was injured at work.
It was his back, lower back.
He had a bunch of pinched nerves in his spine.
It made a big difference in him physically, as far as what he was able to do.
It limited his mobility to walk.
And it left him unable to work.
He went on his short-term disability while he was trying to get his regular disability started.
He would need it too, thanks to the accident.
Left him with a deteriorating spine.
And his condition rapidly got worse.
He kind of went from a cane to a walker. Pretty immobile without some type of assistance.
After the accident, the church rallied to support Dawn and Richard.
They bought clothing and things like that for the family.
Bought him Christmas presents one Christmas.
And through it all, Dawn stood by him.
He had asked Dawn to take care of him, and she said she would.
But she wouldn't take care of him for long. Because in December of 2006, even as Dawn and Richard struggled to deal with his disability, tragedy would strike again. Coming up, the crime scene raises red flags.
It didn't look like a typical home invasion.
And Dawn makes a shocking admission.
You're trying to stab me.
At around 8 a.m. on the morning of December 13th, 2006, 37-year-old Dawn Fowler dialed 911 to report a possible break-in at her home outside Spartanburg, South Carolina.
I just took my kids to school and came home. Carport door had been wide open, and the screen door was open.
She hadn't went inside to check the residence or check on her disabled husband or anything such as that.
She came home and found the door open and basically called in thinking a burglary had occurred.
But when sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene minutes later, they quickly discovered they were dealing with far more than a burglary. 34-year-old Richard Fowler was inside the house, dead.
He was in his bed, covered in blood.
It appeared that he was brutally beaten.
He had a massive amount of trauma to the head.
He had also been stabbed.
It was a horrific scene.
However, while it was obvious how the 34-year-old factory worker had died, the motive behind the brutal murder was far from clear.
It had came in as a possible home invasion.
That's what it was called in as. But once investigators arrived on the scene, they started having doubts.
From the get-go, it didn't look like a typical home invasion.
There appears to be no forced entry.
Nothing was taken.
Typically, when you go to a home invasion, you've got a house that's ransacked, you've got a house that's gone through, you've got items of value that are missing.
But not in this case. It appeared that once inside the house, the killer had gone straight for Richard.
Nothing else was disturbed in the house except for the bedroom.
Not even the presents under the Fowlers' Christmas tree.
There wasn't any electronics that were stolen. No jewelry or valuables seemed to be missing.
Essentially, all the alleged intruder had done was enter the house and savagely beat Richard to death.
He had sustained a lot of injury, which led to one of the most gruesome crime scenes I'd ever been on. That entire room was just a horrendous, bloody crime scene.
Blood was everywhere.
It was a very gruesome scene.
No forced entry, nothing of value taken, and the vicious attack on Richard led the investigators to conclude that it was a targeted killing.
Random killings are very rare.
Which left the investigators wondering who would want Richard dead.
The first people you look at are the folks that are closest, who they're with every day, who they trusted.
But while no one was closer to Richard than Dawn, it didn't appear that she could have been his killer.
There was nothing present on her clothing or her body that would indicate that she was present at the time of the altercation.
Still, it was far too early to rule her out entirely.
They wanted to know what her relationship was now with her ex-husband. It's rare that an ex-spouse lived in the same home, and so they wanted to know what all that was about.
And even as the investigators drove Dawn down to the station to take a formal statement, word of Richard's murder slowly started to spread.
Dawn's mother had called and asked me if I could come to the police department. And that's all she said to me.
Not really a lot of detail on it, just something's wrong with Richard, and he's in the house.
And then once I got to the police department, I was met by Dawn's mother telling me that there had been a break-in and Richard had been murdered.
And that was pretty much what Dawn was telling the investigators, too. When she first sat down in the interview room, Dawn basically repeated what she'd already told the 911 dispatcher.
That she just came back, to drop her kids off at school. She came home and saw the door open from that standpoint and just called 911.
And when the investigators requested that she take a polygraph, Dawn didn't appear to have any reservations.
I'm going to put the blood pressure cuff on. You just put your arm out like that.
In fact, she may have been a little too relaxed about the whole thing.
She was laughing and joking.
You would just turn your left hand over for me, please.
Which was left.
It's okay.
Just didn't seem like an individual that had just home had been burglarized and lost her husband.
However, when the investigators hinted that the burglary appeared suspect, Dawn suggested that Richard's death might have been an assisted suicide.
He got to a point where he wanted to kill himself. Is what he told me.
Could he actually have done such a thing? Dawn certainly didn't rule it out. After all, Richard had been in considerable pain since the accident that left him disabled.
He hurt a lot. He was just getting worse and worse.
And Dawn said that as his pain grew worse, Richard had brooded on the idea of ending his suffering.
2 weeks ago, he said he wanted to be with his mother on Christmas, and she's dead. And that he could pay somebody to take care of her for him.
However, Dawn said that if he had paid someone, she had nothing to do with it.
Did you do anything to Richard to cause his death?
No.
And according to Dawn, all she knew about Richard's murder was what the investigators had told her.
Do you know for sure how Richard's death was caused?
No.
That's what Dawn said. But would the results of the polygraph back her up?
Looking at all the data I looked at, you didn't do that.
She had failed miserably.
Confronted with the results, Dawn denied everything.
Didn't I kill my husband? No, I did not. No, I didn't. No, I don't know who did it. I don't know who did it.
And then, just like that, Dawn's story suddenly changed. And according to Dawn's new story, she did know exactly how Richard died because she was there.
She said he had threatened her with a knife.
Found it in his hand. And he tried to stab me.
But according to Dawn, she'd wrestled the knife from Richard's grasp. Had Dawn killed Richard in self-defense? The investigators were dubious, both because it appeared unlikely that Richard would try and assault Dawn.
He had a spinal injury, and he was unable to work, and eventually in a wheelchair.
And because the killer had done far more than just stab him.
That's what we need in this house. There are other rules. Pretty significant.
There was a massive amount of trauma that took significant force to inflict.
Her story just didn't add up from that standpoint.
So how would Dawn respond when confronted with the inconsistencies in her new story?
What to be the truth?
Dawn's story changed several times.
And this time, according to Dawn, Richard's death wasn't the result of a burglary, a suicide, or self-defense. It was a hit.
I had a friend that had somebody do it.
Coming up, what will shock Dawn's Bible Belt community more? The identity of her friend.
He was a youth pastor at the church.
Or her alleged motive for wanting Richard dead.
I think it all comes down to money and greed.
By the afternoon of December 13th, 2006, it had only been a few hours since sheriff's deputies found Dawn Fowler's ex-husband, 34-year-old Richard Fowler, murdered in their home outside Spartanburg, South Carolina.
It looked like there had been a break-in at her home.
At least that's what Dawn had initially claimed.
I didn't know if somebody had broke in or what was going on, so I was calling 911.
But the investigators had their doubts.
Once we got there, we noticed that it wasn't your typical home invasion.
There was no forced entry, nothing, and that raised red flags.
And when they pressed Dawn during the interview,
we were able to get her to confess.
Dawn didn't confess to committing the murder herself, though. Instead, the 37-year-old mother of 3 told the investigators it had all been arranged by a friend.
Who's his friend?
It's a friend from church.
What's his name?
Robert.
Robert Haidman was a youth pastor at the same church that Dawn attended.
Although the ministry wasn't his full-time job.
Robert basically was a handyman by trade. He was kind of a fix-it fella.
One that Dawn, due to Richard's disability, had come to depend upon.
Things that needed hauling out, some just stuff that needed doing around the house, and he actually came and did it for them.
And once Richard required a wheelchair to get around, Robert had come through again.
He reached out to Richard and said that he would help install a wheelchair ramp.
In her interview, Dawn admitted that Robert had spent so much time helping around the house that she and the youth pastor had become close.
And they struck up a friendship. I started talking.
And according to Dawn, she'd eventually told Robert a huge secret about her life with Richard, something she'd never told anyone.
He was abusive to the kids.
She also claimed that Richard had abused her, that her story about him pulling a knife on her was essentially true.
He has pulled a knife on me several times.
She also accused Richard of verbal abuse.
She said that basically that he had been cruel to her or been mean to her.
Calling me stupid and telling me I was crazy and stuff like that.
Dawn said that it wasn't long before Robert was well aware of the way Richard treated her and the kids, too.
He heard him on the phone hollering at the kids, and he's been around them, talking to them and telling them they're stupid. And he said that nobody should have to live like that.
And she said that Robert had promised to do something about it.
I was just talking to him, and he said he would take care of it.
Not that, according to Dawn, he'd said exactly how he planned on taking care of it.
I didn't know they would kill him. I just didn't want him to hurt me or the kids, you know.
Not that the investigators necessarily believed her.
It looks like they're trying to evade responsibility for their actions. And we're not thinking about something else.
I didn't do it. I promise.
But if Dawn hadn't arranged to have her ex-husband killed, the investigators still had one more question.
Why would Robert do this for you? Are you having an affair with Robert?
The answer was no, according to Dawn.
We're just friends.
Whether that was true or not, what Dawn had admitted to was more than enough for the investigators.
Dawn was arrested the day of the murder.
Naturally, once the investigators had Dawn in custody, the next thing they wanted to do was talk to Robert Haidman. And as it turned out, they wouldn't have to go far to find him.
Haidman was standing outside of the sheriff's office with us.
He'd come down to the sheriff's office with the Fowler's minister.
Mr. Haidman came to the sheriff's department to check on Dawn, see how she was doing.
At least that's what he'd told Richard's family.
He was very nervous, and he kept pacing outside of the sheriff's office, into the sheriff's office, just back and forth.
It was almost as if he was expecting something.
Myself and another investigator went downstairs and requested to speak with him, brought him upstairs, and began to interview him.
Not that the interview lasted long, once the investigators started asking Robert what he knew about the murder.
He immediately requested an attorney.
He would need one, too, because as soon as Robert Haidman sat down in the interview room, the investigators couldn't help but notice something.
He had blood on his forehead.
Was it Richard's blood? That would be up to the crime lab to determine.
We had a forensic examination on Robert, and swabs were taken.
However, coupled with Dawn's story, the tiny patch of blood on Robert's forehead was more than enough for the investigators to place him in custody, too.
He is arrested. They do go ahead and process him.
Once Robert Heidman was in custody, the investigators searched the youth minister's house. And while the search didn't reveal anything relevant to the murder investigation, they did make one rather ironic discovery.
When we pulled up to serve the search warrant on the house, standing in the front yard was 10 Commandments. And I was sitting here thinking to myself, my God, man, this guy just killed an individual.
By then, Richard's family was reeling at the news that Dawn had been arrested for his murder.
I would have never thought Dawn had anything to do with it.
And the same was true of the youth minister who'd been so helpful around the house.
At that point, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't imagine why he was taken into custody.
From everything that we heard, my uncle thought the world of him.
Even the authorities admitted that the youth minister made an unlikely murderer.
Robert Heim had never been in any criminal trouble whatsoever.
So how had the youth minister become a killer? Over the next several days, the investigators interviewed members of the Fowler's church. Church members told the investigators that the relationship between Dawn and Robert had started out innocently enough.
When her and her husband started going to church there, of course, the kids got involved in the youth program, and that's how they met each other.
And over time, Dawn and Robert had grown close.
Due to Richard's failing health, he wasn't able to attend as much as she was able to.
However, church members told the investigators they thought Dawn had become too close to the youth minister.
They were always together, always talking, always sitting together in church.
To the point that some in the congregation wondered what they were up to out of church.
Other church members began to have their doubts, began to have their suspicions.
And the speculation really took off once the youth minister started doing odd jobs for the Fowlers.
It was almost like it was a way that he could be involved in their life and see Dawn as well.
And whether Dawn and the youth minister were having an affair or not, there was no doubt he was stepping into her ex-husband's role, almost becoming a surrogate father to her children.
He would come over to play ball with the kids all the time.
But did that mean that Dawn was telling the truth? That upon hearing of Richard's alleged abuse, Robert had taken it upon himself to take care of her problem? The investigators weren't so sure.
Dawn said, she had been abused by him physically and verbally also, but we never found any evidence of that.
She had never been to the doctor, never to the emergency room, and police had never been called.
In fact, considering that Richard was basically confined to a wheelchair, his family found Dawn's claims of physical abuse completely ridiculous.
I'm sure Richard didn't abuse Dawn because, for one, he wasn't physically able. I think he would have hurt himself worse than he would have hurt her.
And the verbal abuse? Richard's family had their doubts about that, too. Especially Dawn's claim that he'd verbally abused his daughters.
He loved his kids. I mean, he was really passionate about his kids. He talked about his kids all the time.
All in all, it led the family and the authorities to the same conclusion.
Dawn was lying about the abuse.
She manipulated him into believing that her husband was abusing her.
And why would she lie about that? Pure selfishness, according to the prosecutor.
I think she was tired of taking care of him. She wanted to kind of get free of him.
But was that Dawn's only motivation for getting rid of Richard? The authorities didn't think so.
He had gotten a settlement from workman's comp.
And according to the family, Richard had been reluctant to share the windfall with Dawn.
He seen it wasn't going to last him long, and he sat on his money. And I think that made Dawn a little bit angry.
And after taking him in with no other income to support them, Dawn was angry enough, the authorities figured, that rather than let Richard sit on his money, she'd simply decided to take it.
It all comes down to money and greed. I think she wanted bigger and better things. And when he received his settlement, I think she saw that as her chance.
Coming up, Dawn has her day in court.
We had her dead rights.
But will she be held accountable for her crimes?
She went in there and played the system.
All eyes were on Dawn Fowler when she walked into the Spartanburg County, South Carolina General Sessions Court on September 24th, 2008.
There was family there in an extremely packed courtroom.
The 38-year-old mother of three had been charged with murdering her ex-husband, Richard Fowler, with the help of her youth minister boyfriend, Robert Heidman.
There was a good bit of media interest because of how this had came about.
We're in the Bible Belt. This just does not happen here, where a youth pastor has an affair with a church lady, a member of the congregation, and then they come up with a plan to brutally murder her husband.
Arrested the day of the murder, Dawn's confession had been the key to charging both Dawn and Robert with the crime.
I was just talking to him, and he said he would take care of it.
However, Dawn hadn't come to court that day in order to stand trial. Instead, she had come to testify. Initially, since the prosecutors considered her the mastermind behind the murder, they had planned to try her first.
We had her dead rights, from the story she had told.
I didn't know they would kill him. I just didn't want him.
And the prosecutors expected to put her away for a long time.
She was facing a murder charge at that time. The murder charge could be 30 to life.
But would she ever face a jury? On the very day that Dawn's trial had been scheduled to begin, her attorney made a last-minute call to the prosecutor.
The defense attorney said, "Can we talk to you about cooperating?"
And despite the fact that they had Dawn dead to rights, the prosecutors didn't reject the offer. Because while the case against her was all but open and shut, they needed Dawn to convict the youth minister.
Without her, Heidman would have been a very tough case, based off the evidence we just had in his case.
Heidman never admitted his involvement.
Unless she cooperated and testified to fill in the stories, I knew it was going to be a tough challenge. You have no explanation about the motive. You have nothing to really tie together.
So in exchange for her testimony, the prosecutors agreed to reduce the charges against Dawn down to conspiracy and accessory to murder after the fact. Charges that carried a sentence ranging from probation all the way up to 50 years in prison.
We did not guarantee her any kind of sentence. It was going to be left to the judge's discretion.
However, it did take the possibility of life in prison off the table.
She decided she wanted to try to cooperate.
Dawn took the deal. And on September 23rd, immediately before Robert Heidman's trial began, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy and accessory after the fact, with her sentencing deferred until after she testified.
We were using her as our main witness.
Richard Fowler's family was disgusted by the deal.
She went in there and played the system.
And that's basically what the family figured she was doing when she walked into court as the prosecution's star witness.
Dawn would claim anything as if it's to her benefit.
She'll go through any means to get what she wants or what she needs.
Although when Dawn took the stand, she hesitated, falling back on her original story.
She just talked about how they became friends and that she told him she had a problem, and he said, "Well, I'll take care of your problem." She just blamed it all on Heidman.
But as the prosecutor reminded her, that wasn't part of the deal.
I said, the problem we got is obviously you set up a murder in this case, and you need to obviously confess your part of it.
They had to coax her a little bit.
So with her plea deal on the line, Dawn finally admitted how she'd convinced Robert Heidman to kill her ex-husband.
Dawn told Robert that she was sick of him, that he had treated her poorly, that there was some abuse going on.
She would play the pity card. A lot of men will sympathize for a woman for that reason.
I think she manipulated him into believing that they were being abused.
And if that weren't enough,
She also made mention of this workers' compensation, that she has this, he has this $90,000 coming in.
She said that that would be available upon Richard's death.
Not that the youth minister appeared all that interested in the money.
I think he really loved her and he believed everything that she was saying to him. And I think he thought that if he murdered my uncle, that he was helping her, that he was protecting her in some way.
She made Robert Heidman feel like he was doing the world a good deed.
Then, once she detailed how she'd talked Robert Heidman into taking care of her problem, Dawn testified about how the final plans were laid.
The night before the incident was the Spartanburg Christmas parade. That's when this plan had developed.
Dawn testified that while their neighbors had watched the Christmas parade, she and the youth minister had huddled together and made their final plans.
We found witnesses that they were speaking off to the side and everything such as that.
According to Dawn, the plan was that she'd leave the door unlocked the next morning when she took the kids to school.
So he can get inside the house and do what he needs to do.
Which, according to Dawn, was bludgeon her disabled ex-husband to death as he slept.
Richard was beat to death beyond recognition.
And then once Heidman had committed the murder, she would come home and call 911.
The signal that the problem was taken care of was that the door would be propped open.
In other words, exactly as it had played out in reality.
I just took my kids to school and came home. Carport door was wide open, and the screen door was open.
The 911 call wasn't the only thing that corroborated Dawn's account either. The prosecutors also had Dawn and Robert's phone records.
Authorities were able to establish between Dawn and Robert that there were several calls made between 4 and 7 in the morning.
But most of all, the prosecutors had some powerful evidence that put the youth minister at the murder scene.
The DNA test on the blood from Mr. Hyman's forehead came back to the victim in this case, Richard Fowler.
Between Dawn's testimony, the phone records, and the blood evidence, the case against the youth minister looked solid.
I felt pretty good about it because obviously everything corroborated her story.
So naturally, when it was the defense's turn, they focused on discrediting Dawn's story.
The two things they really attacked was obviously that she'd been offered, a plea offer with her testimony was one of the things. And the second thing was basically that she wasn't telling the truth, that, the abuse wasn't true.
They also painted Dawn as someone desperate to get rid of her disabled ex-husband.
She had tried to get other people to do it.
And the defense even put one of those people on the stand.
She was actually trading pills with him and everything, was trying to get him to do the murder for her.
In fact, pills weren't all Dawn had been trading with the man.
It was a guy she was having an affair with. I was not shocked that she was having an affair. She had been unfaithful before, which led to the divorce.
On the stand, Dawn's lover testified that he'd backed out of committing the murder. But did that mean Robert Heidman had stepped in? To answer that question, the defense called the youth minister to the stand.
He says he received a phone call saying, I need your help, come over here right now. He comes over and he says Dawn is actually beating Richard to death in the bed.
And according to Robert, that not only explained how Dawn's ex-husband died, it also explained how he'd ended up with the dead man's blood on his forehead.
He basically said, I'm guilty of accessory after the fact, helping her cover up the murder.
Coming up, the jury decides Robert Heidman's fate.
He will never get out of prison.
But what will Dawn's sentence be?
I believe Dawn is just as guilty as Robert.
On Friday, September 26, 2008, the jury in Spartanburg, South Carolina, announced that it had reached a verdict in the trial of Robert Heidman, the youth minister accused of conspiring with Dawn Fowler to murder her ex-husband.
Dawn had met Robert at church. They started an affair, and that essentially led to them coming up with this plot to kill Richard.
a plot that Dawn had detailed on the stand, testifying against her co-conspirator as part of a plea deal.
She decided she wanted to try to cooperate.
Robert Heidman had also testified in his defense.
Dawn said that Robert killed Richard, and then Robert said Dawn killed Richard. It was a he said, she said situation.
Which one would the jury believe? Either way, it hadn't taken long to reach the decision.
They were out for, I think, a couple hours.
And when the verdict was read,
it was guilty of murder.
Immediately after the guilty verdict, the judge sentenced Heidman to life in prison without parole.
He will never get out of prison.
But while neither the authorities nor the victim's family doubt the youth minister deserved what he got, there was no doubt that Dawn was ultimately to blame for Richard's murder.
She's the reason why this occurred. Mr. Heidman was the weapon.
Robert was an individual that basically got took. Robert was a pawn in the play.
I can truly say in my heart, even though he committed this crime, I have no hatred toward him. I truly believe that he's sorry for what he did and that he wished he had never gotten involved with her.
And on October 29, 2008, it was finally Dawn's turn for sentencing.
The judge ultimately sentenced her to 13 years in jail.
I don't think it's fair what she got.
I thought she was going away for life. I never thought she would be able to get out of that.
And the fact that Robert was serving life made Dawn's sentence an even bigger injustice in the eyes of friends and family.
I believe Dawn is just as guilty as Robert.
She left the door open. She made the plan.
And whether she pled guilty to it or not, in the mind of Richard's sister, that can only mean one thing.
She's a murderer.
On the morning of September 5, 1930, inside the walls of the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, the routines of the prison unfolded with the same disciplined precision they always had. Steel doors opened and closed. Guards exchanged brief conversations in quiet voices. Footsteps echoed through long corridors of stone and iron. Nothing about the prison's appearance suggested that history was about to record the final moments of one of America's most infamous violent offenders. There were no crowds gathered beyond the walls, no dramatic speeches, and no last-minute pleas for mercy. The man waiting for execution had made it clear that he wanted none. His name was Carl Panzram. By the time he reached the gallows, his reputation had already become almost impossible to separate from legend. He claimed to have murdered 21 people. He claimed responsibility for more than 1,000 sexual assaults committed against men and boys. He claimed that the true number of his victims might never be known because many had disappeared beneath rivers, oceans, or into places where no investigation would ever reach them. Historians, investigators, and criminologists would later spend decades attempting to distinguish verified facts from extraordinary confessions. Some murders could be connected to evidence. Others remained impossible to prove. Even today, nearly a century later, certainty and uncertainty exist side by side in the story of Carl Panzram. Yet on that September morning, none of those questions appeared to matter to the man himself. According to historical accounts, he showed no fear as his execution approached. He did not seek forgiveness. He did not attempt to explain away his crimes. He did not ask that anyone remember him kindly. Instead, everything written about him suggests that he faced death with the same hostility that had defined much of his life. Hatred seemed to be the one constant that had survived every prison sentence, every beating, every escape, every arrest, and every confession. For many criminals, the final hours before execution become a time for reflection. Some express regret. Some insist upon their innocence. Others speak about family, religion, or hope for redemption. Carl Panzram stood apart from nearly every one of those patterns. The surviving records describe a man who rejected sympathy as completely as he rejected society itself. Whatever humanity remained inside him had long since disappeared, or perhaps, if his own writings are to be believed, he believed it had never existed at all. His execution closed one chapter, but it opened another. Almost immediately, questions began to emerge. Who exactly had Carl Panzram been? How much of what he confessed was true? Could one individual really have committed such an extraordinary catalog of violence across multiple states and even beyond the borders of the United States? Or had years inside prisons, combined with overwhelming rage, transformed confession into something larger than history could ever verify? Those questions continue to shape every serious examination of his life. Unlike many notorious murder cases, the central mystery surrounding Carl Panzram is not simply who committed the crimes. He admitted to many of them himself. The deeper mystery lies elsewhere. Which of his confessions reflected documented reality, and which belonged only to the pages of a memoir written by a man who repeatedly declared that he hated every human being alive? That distinction matters because historical truth demands evidence. Confession alone, especially from someone who openly embraced violence and chaos, cannot automatically become fact. Throughout this story, verified events will stand apart from claims that historians have never been able to confirm. The uncertainty is not a flaw in the historical record. It is part of the story itself. What is beyond dispute is that Carl Panzram lived a life marked by relentless crime. Over the course of roughly 3 decades during the early 20th century, he became known for burglary, robbery, assault, arson, prison escapes, and repeated incarceration. Records show that he spent time in countless jails, prisons, and reform institutions across the United States. His encounters with the justice system became so frequent that imprisonment appeared almost ordinary. Freedom rarely lasted long before another offense returned him to another cell. Yet even those documented crimes represent only part of the picture. His own writings described acts of violence on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Among the most disturbing claims were stories of sailors invited aboard his yacht before disappearing forever beneath coastal waters. Children murdered in circumstances that investigators struggled to verify. And killings allegedly committed while working in Portuguese Angola, where he claimed bodies were thrown into crocodile-infested rivers. These accounts have been repeated in books and documentaries for decades. But responsible historians continue to emphasize an essential fact. Many of these confessions remain unsupported by independent evidence. The uncertainty surrounding them is as significant as the confessions themselves. Ironically, one of the most important sources documenting Carl Panzram's life did not come from detectives or prosecutors. It came from Carl Panzram himself. While imprisoned at Leavenworth, he encountered a prison guard named Henry Lesser. Unlike many officials Panzram had known throughout his years behind bars, Lesser treated him with a measure of respect. He provided him with paper and pencils and encouraged him to write about his life. What followed became one of the most unsettling prison memoirs ever produced by an American inmate. The manuscript, later published as Killer, a Journal of Murder, offered readers direct access to the mind of a man who described himself as being consumed by hatred. It also presented historians with a difficult challenge. How much could they trust the words of a man who admitted that violence had become the defining purpose of his existence? Those pages would preserve not only detailed confessions, but also repeated declarations about humanity itself. Panzram wrote that he hated society, religion, governments, laws, and even himself. Among his most frequently quoted statements was a chilling declaration that he hated the entire human race. Whether those words reflected genuine psychological beliefs or represented another attempt to shock his readers remains impossible to determine. What cannot be denied is that they reveal a worldview almost entirely devoid of compassion. As this story unfolds, it becomes tempting to search for simple explanations. It would be comforting to identify one moment, one tragedy, or one decision that transformed a child into a man associated with extraordinary brutality. History rarely offers such convenient answers. Carl Panzram's early years included poverty, repeated delinquency, confinement in a reform institution, and allegations of severe abuse described in his own memoir. Many researchers believe those experiences contributed to the development of his violent outlook. At the same time, countless people endure traumatic childhoods without inflicting unimaginable suffering upon others. Understanding the circumstances surrounding Carl Panzram's life does not excuse the crimes that can be verified, nor does it validate every confession he later recorded. Instead, it reminds us that human behavior is often more complex than any single explanation can capture. Before he became a prisoner awaiting execution, before investigators attempted to untangle truth from confession, before his name appeared in books about America's most violent offenders, Carl Panzram was simply a boy growing up on a farm in Minnesota. The journey from that rural childhood to the gallows at Leavenworth would span less than 40 years. Yet within those decades lay a story filled with violence, imprisonment, unanswered questions, and countless lives forever altered. To understand how that transformation occurred, we must leave the prison behind and travel back to the closing years of the 19th century, where the first chapter of Carl Panzram's life quietly began. Carl Panzram entered the world on June 28, 1891, near East Grand Forks, Minnesota, at a time when much of rural America was still defined by farms, hard physical labor, and close-knit immigrant communities. He was born into a large family of German ancestry whose daily life revolved around survival rather than comfort. Every member of the household was expected to contribute, and childhood offered few luxuries. Long hours of work, strict discipline, and limited opportunities were common realities for many farming families during that era. Yet while these conditions were difficult, they were not unusual. Thousands of children across the American Midwest experienced similar hardships without eventually becoming notorious criminals. For that reason, historians remain careful not to treat Carl Panzram's early environment as a complete explanation for the violence that later defined his life. It provides context, but not certainty. Even as a young boy, Panzram later claimed that he felt different from those around him. In his prison writings, he described himself as a child who lied habitually, stole whenever the opportunity arose, fought with other children, and began drinking alcohol at an unusually early age. According to his own account, he seemed drawn toward confrontation rather than cooperation. Whether these memories were entirely accurate is impossible to determine, as they were recorded decades later while he was imprisoned and reflecting on a lifetime of crime. Nevertheless, contemporary records do support the broader picture that he experienced repeated conflicts with authority during childhood. By the age of 8, he had already appeared before a juvenile court after incidents involving theft, drunkenness, and disorderly behavior. Such encounters were extraordinary for someone so young and suggested that his pattern of offending had begun long before adulthood. Small acts of theft soon became increasingly frequent. Items disappeared from neighbors, local businesses, and anyone unfortunate enough to cross paths with him. Each offense reinforced his reputation as a troublesome child who resisted discipline rather than learning from it. Adults attempted punishment, warnings, and supervision, but nothing appeared to change his behavior for long. Eventually, local authorities concluded that ordinary interventions had failed. The solution, they believed, was institutional reform. Around the age of 12, following repeated thefts and continuing misconduct, Carl Panzram was committed to the Minnesota State Training School, a reform institution intended for juvenile offenders. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such facilities were established with the stated purpose of transforming troubled children into responsible citizens through discipline. labor, and education. On paper, they promise structure and rehabilitation. In practice, conditions varied dramatically from one institution to another, and many reform schools across America later became infamous for harsh treatment and physical punishment. For Carl Panzram, the Minnesota State Training School would become the defining experience of his childhood. Nearly every serious biography of his life returns to this institution because of what he later claimed occurred behind its walls. According to the memoir he wrote while imprisoned decades later, the reform school was not a place of education, but one of relentless brutality. He alleged that staff members regularly beat children with leather straps, subjected them to severe physical punishment, withheld food as discipline, shackled inmates for extended periods, and forced them into exhausting labor. Most disturbing of all were his repeated claims that he suffered sexual assaults at the hands of employees and older individuals inside the institution. These allegations occupy a central place in his autobiography and have been widely discussed by historians studying his life. However, it is important to recognize the limitations of the historical record. While abuse in some reform institutions of that era has been documented elsewhere, not every specific allegation made by Panzram can be independently verified. His memoir remains the primary source for many of these claims, meaning historians cannot conclusively establish every event exactly as he described it. Even with that uncertainty, researchers generally agree that the environment within many juvenile institutions of the period was frequently harsh and punitive. Rather than addressing the emotional or psychological needs of troubled children, discipline often relied upon fear and violence. If Panzram's descriptions were even partially accurate, they portray a childhood marked by repeated humiliation and suffering at an age when trust and stability were desperately needed. Whether these experiences fundamentally altered his personality or merely intensified tendencies already present remains one of the enduring questions surrounding his life. Panzram himself left no doubt about how he viewed the institution. In his writings, he portrayed it as the place where any remaining capacity for empathy was destroyed. He described learning that cruelty was rewarded, that power belonged to whoever could inflict the greatest pain, and that authority existed not to protect but to dominate. Again, these reflections came from the perspective of an adult looking back after years of violence, and they cannot be accepted uncritically as objective history. Yet they provide insight into how he understood his own transformation. He did not describe the reform school as a failed attempt to help him. He described it as the beginning of a lifelong war against humanity. Eventually, Panzram escaped from the institution. Freedom, however, did not lead to a fresh start. Instead, it marked the beginning of years spent wandering across the United States with little stability and almost no lawful direction. Still a teenager, he traveled aboard freight trains, drifting from one town to another in search of opportunities to survive. Life on the rails exposed countless young drifters to hunger, exploitation, and crime. For many, it was an act of desperation born from poverty. For Panzram, it became the foundation of a criminal lifestyle that would continue for decades. He later suggested that by this stage, theft and violence no longer felt like choices. They had become habits. Each successful burglary or robbery reinforced the belief that force achieved results more effectively than honesty ever could. Trust in society, if it had existed at all, appeared completely absent. Looking back across his own life, Panzram repeatedly insisted that he had come to hate nearly everyone he encountered. Although it would be tempting to trace that hatred directly to the abuse he claimed to have suffered, history offers no simple equation between trauma and future violence. Millions of individuals experience terrible abuse without becoming offenders. Likewise, not every violent criminal endured comparable childhood experiences. Human behavior develops through an intricate combination of personality, environment, opportunity, and countless other influences that historians and psychologists continue to debate. What can be said with confidence is that Carl Panzram's childhood provided almost no examples of stability, encouragement, or meaningful rehabilitation. Instead, the available evidence suggests a progression from early delinquency to institutional punishment, and then to a life spent almost constantly in conflict with the law. Rather than interrupting his criminal behavior, each encounter with authority appeared to deepen his hostility. The institutions designed to reform him failed to achieve their purpose. Whether because of their methods, his personality, or a combination of both, they did not return to society a rehabilitated young man. Instead, they released someone who increasingly viewed violence as both practical and inevitable. Years later, when prison guard Henry Lesser encouraged Panzram to write about his past, those memories dominated many pages of his manuscript. He returned repeatedly to childhood, not with nostalgia, but with bitterness. In his own telling, the foundations of everything he later became had already been laid before he reached adulthood. The anger he expressed toward governments, religion, law, and humanity itself seemed rooted in the belief that society had shown him only cruelty from the very beginning. Whether readers accept that interpretation or not, the historical record demonstrates that by the time Carl Panzram left his youth behind, he had accumulated repeated arrests, experienced institutional confinement, and embraced a life outside the boundaries of ordinary society. The years ahead would not bring reconciliation or reform. Instead, they would reveal an escalating pattern of burglary, robbery, violence, prison sentences, and escapes that carried him across the United States. What began as juvenile delinquency would evolve into a criminal career so extensive that he would eventually claim to have passed through nearly 100 jails and prisons. It was no longer the story of a troubled child. It had become the story of a man who appeared determined to wage war against every rule, every institution, and ultimately every human life that stood in his path. By the time Carl Panzram left the Minnesota State Training School behind, whether through escape or release, the possibility of an ordinary life appeared to grow more distant with every passing year. He was still young, yet his experiences had already placed him in repeated conflict with authority. Instead of returning to a stable home and gradually building a lawful future, he entered a world defined by constant movement, uncertainty, and crime. During the opening years of the 20th century, thousands of young men traveled across the United States aboard freight trains in search of work, food, or simply another place to survive. For Carl Panzram, those rail lines became more than transportation. They became the roads that carried him from one offense to the next. He drifted from town to town, rarely remaining anywhere long enough to establish roots. Every new destination offered another opportunity for theft, another confrontation with law enforcement, and eventually another prison sentence. According to the historical record, burglary quickly became one of his preferred crimes. Homes, businesses, and isolated buildings represented opportunities rather than boundaries. Breaking into property was not an occasional act committed out of desperation, but an increasingly routine method of obtaining money and supplies. Alongside burglary came robbery, assault, and arson. These offenses reflected an escalating willingness to use intimidation and violence whenever it suited his objectives. The exact details of every crime committed during these early years are difficult to reconstruct, but the overall pattern is unmistakable. Arrest followed release, release was followed by another offense, and each conviction carried him to yet another jail or prison somewhere across the country. Rather than interrupting his criminal behavior, incarceration became an almost permanent feature of his adult life. Historians note that Panzram eventually spent time in nearly 100 different prisons, jails, and correctional institutions throughout the United States. The sheer number illustrates not only the frequency of his offenses, but also the constant movement that characterized his existence. Few places held him for long before he was transferred, released, or managed to escape. Escape itself became another recurring chapter in his criminal career. Prison walls represented obstacles to overcome rather than consequences to accept. Whenever opportunities presented themselves, he attempted to flee confinement and return to life on the move. These repeated escapes reinforced his reputation among law enforcement as an exceptionally dangerous and persistent offender. Authorities learned that imprisonment alone rarely prevented Carl Panzram from committing further crimes once he regained his freedom. During these years, he also briefly enlisted in the United States Army. For many young men of that era, military service offered discipline, structure, and the possibility of a new beginning. In Panzram's case, that opportunity proved remarkably short-lived. Historical accounts indicate that his violent conduct soon led to his discharge. Even within an institution built upon strict hierarchy and discipline, his behavior remained incompatible with military life. The Army failed to redirect his path, just as earlier reform efforts had failed during his childhood. Each unsuccessful attempt at rehabilitation appeared to deepen the divide between Panzram and the society around him. As his criminal record expanded, so did the intensity of his resentment toward authority. Throughout his later memoir, he repeatedly described police officers, judges, prison officials, and government institutions not merely as opponents, but as enemies. Whether this hostility emerged primarily from his early experiences or developed through years of incarceration is impossible to know with certainty. What is clear is that by adulthood, his relationship with society had become almost entirely adversarial. Laws were obstacles, institutions represented oppression. Punishment inspired anger rather than reflection. The cycle seemed impossible to break. Freedom became simply the interval between prison sentences. One of the striking characteristics of Carl Panzram's early criminal career was its extraordinary geographic range. Unlike offenders who operated within a single city or region, he traveled continuously across multiple states. Freight trains, ships, temporary jobs, and transient labor carried him from one part of the country to another. This constant movement made it difficult for authorities to recognize broader patterns in his activities. Local police departments dealt with isolated burglaries or robberies without necessarily realizing that the same offender had committed similar crimes hundreds of miles away only weeks earlier. Long before centralized criminal databases existed, a transient offender could move through jurisdictions with relative anonymity. Panzram's itinerant lifestyle took full advantage of those limitations. According to his own later writings, these years also marked a profound psychological transformation. He portrayed himself as someone who had stopped expecting fairness, compassion, or justice from anyone. Whether describing strangers, employers, police officers, or prison officials, his memoir consistently returned to the same themes of hostility and mistrust. He increasingly presented violence not as something extraordinary, but as a practical solution. Whenever conflict arose, historians remain cautious when interpreting these passages because they reflect Panzram's own retrospective account rather than independent observation. Even so, they reveal the worldview he wished readers to understand, one in which humanity itself had become the object of his contempt. It is important to recognize that during this period, Carl Panzram had not yet become infamous for the confessions that would later dominate discussions of his life. His reputation rested instead upon crimes that were sadly familiar to police departments of the era: theft, burglary, robbery, assault, arson, and repeated escapes from custody. Yet beneath those documented offenses, a more dangerous trajectory may already have been forming. Years later, Panzram would claim that many of his most violent crimes had begun during this period of constant wandering. Those confessions included allegations of murders and sexual assaults committed across various locations in the United States. However, historians emphasize that many of these claims remain impossible to verify. The absence of surviving evidence, witnesses, or investigative records prevents definitive conclusions. As a result, Responsible historical accounts distinguish carefully between what can be documented and what exists only in Panzram's own testimony. This distinction would become even more significant as his story unfolded. During the first decades of the 20th century, communication between distant law enforcement agencies remained limited compared to modern standards. Fingerprint systems were still developing, forensic science was relatively primitive, and centralized criminal intelligence barely existed. A highly mobile offender could exploit these weaknesses with relative ease. Panzram's constant travel meant that each arrest often appeared disconnected from previous offenses committed elsewhere. He became known locally wherever he happened to be arrested, yet his broader criminal career remained fragmented across countless jurisdictions. The result was a life spent moving almost endlessly between freedom and incarceration. No sooner would one sentence end than another offense would begin. Employment, when it occurred at all, was temporary and unstable. Honest labor never developed into a lasting alternative. Crime remained the defining structure of his adult existence. Looking back, it becomes apparent that these years established patterns that would continue until the end of his life. Perpetual movement, repeated imprisonment, escalating hostility, and increasing violence. They also laid the foundation for one of the most remarkable episodes in his criminal history. In 1920, after years of burglaries and robberies, Carl Panzram committed an offense that attracted far greater historical attention than many of his previous crimes. He successfully broke into the home of former United States President William Howard Taft in New Haven, Connecticut. According to historical records, he escaped with cash, jewelry, bonds, a commemorative watch, and a Colt pistol belonging to the former president. In later years, Panzram claimed that the proceeds from this burglary financed the purchase of a small yacht named Akista. That vessel, he would later confess, became the setting for some of the most disturbing crimes he ever described. Whether every detail of those confessions can be believed remains one of the central questions of his story. Yet there is no dispute that the Taft burglary marked a turning point. It provided both the resources and, according to Panzram himself, the means to carry out acts of violence that would later become inseparable from his notorious legacy. As the years passed, Carl Panzram no longer appeared to be merely a career burglar drifting from one prison to another. He was becoming something far darker, a man whose own writings would eventually claim that theft had never been his true purpose. According to him, violence itself had become the destination. By the early 1920s, Carl Panzram had spent years moving across the United States as a transient criminal, drifting between freight trains, temporary jobs, burglaries, arrests, prisons, and escapes. His life had settled into a relentless cycle that seemed incapable of producing anything except more violence and more incarceration. Yet while his criminal record continued to grow, another aspect of his story was taking shape, one that would eventually distinguish him from many other violent offenders of his era. It was not simply the crimes he committed that fascinated later historians, criminologists, and writers. It was the philosophy he claimed had guided those crimes. More than any robbery or prison escape, Carl Panzram became remembered for the extraordinary hatred he expressed toward virtually every aspect of human existence. Much of what is known about this worldview comes from the manuscript he wrote years later while imprisoned at Leavenworth. Encouraged by prison guard Henry Lesser, Panzram recorded his memories, reflections, and confessions in remarkable detail. The resulting document, later published as Killer, a journal of murder, remains the single most important source for understanding how Panzram viewed himself. At the same time, historians consistently caution that the memoir must be read critically. It represents the perspective of a man already convicted of serious crimes, writing while awaiting execution, and many of his claims cannot be independently verified. Nevertheless, the emotions expressed throughout the manuscript are strikingly consistent. Whether discussing childhood, prison, strangers, religion, or government, one emotion dominates almost every page: hatred. Unlike many autobiographies written by convicted criminals, Panzram's memoir contains almost no effort to seek sympathy. He did not portray himself as misunderstood, nor did he ask readers to excuse his actions because of his difficult upbringing. Instead, he repeatedly insisted that he despised nearly everyone he had ever encountered. According to his own writings, this hatred extended beyond individual people. It embraced society itself. Governments, legal systems, organized religion, and social institutions were all presented as objects of contempt. He claimed that the world had shown him nothing but cruelty, and in return he intended to show the world none of the compassion it expected from him. Among the many statements preserved in his manuscript, one became particularly infamous. "I hate the whole human race." Few quotations have become as closely associated with Carl Panzram as those words. They have appeared repeatedly in books, documentaries, and discussions examining his life. Yet the sentence carries significance beyond its shock value. It summarizes the central narrative Panzram wished to leave behind. Whether or not every confession he made was accurate, he wanted history to remember him as a man who had rejected humanity completely. Another statement attributed to him pushed this philosophy even further. He wrote that if every person in the world possessed a single neck, he would gladly strangle them all. It is a sentence that reveals not merely anger toward particular enemies, but an almost limitless hostility directed at humanity itself. Such declarations naturally invite psychological interpretation. Readers often wonder whether they reflect mental illness, severe personality disturbance, the cumulative effects of childhood trauma, or something else entirely. Responsible historians, however, are careful in approaching such questions. Modern psychiatric diagnoses cannot reliably be applied to historical figures based solely on surviving documents. Although Panzram's writings reveal extraordinary hostility and a profound absence of empathy, they do not allow definitive medical conclusions. What can be stated with confidence is that his own words consistently describe a man who embraced violence not simply as a means to an end, but as an expression of his worldview. His memoir repeatedly portrays violence as retaliation against a society he believed had wronged him. From childhood onward, throughout the manuscript, Panzram returned again and again to memories of punishment, abuse, and imprisonment. According to his account, these experiences convinced him that compassion was an illusion and that power belonged only to those capable of inflicting fear. Whether this belief accurately reflected reality or merely his own interpretation of it is impossible to know. Other children endured harsh reform schools without embracing lifelong violence. Likewise, many adults experienced repeated imprisonment without developing the extreme philosophy expressed in Panzram's writings. His conclusions were ultimately his own. One of the remarkable aspects of his memoir is the complete absence of remorse. Many offenders, particularly those facing execution, eventually express regret for at least some of the suffering they caused. They may seek forgiveness from victims' families, religious leaders, or society. Panzram's writings contain virtually none of these elements. Instead, he frequently suggested that if given another opportunity, he would repeat his actions. Such declarations reinforce the perception that he remained entirely unrepentant until the end of his life. Whether these statements reflected genuine conviction or an effort to cultivate a terrifying reputation cannot be determined with certainty. Yet they profoundly influenced how later generations understood him. Another recurring theme throughout the memoir is self-hatred. Although Panzram repeatedly directed hostility outward toward humanity, he also wrote with contempt about himself. He did not present himself as superior to others. Rather, he described himself as part of the same corrupt and violent world he despised. This distinction is important because it complicates the simplistic image of a man motivated solely by arrogance or cruelty. His writings instead suggest someone who believed destruction was inevitable because he saw little worth either in others or in himself. Historians continue to debate how literally these passages should be interpreted. Memoirs written in prison often serve multiple purposes: confession, justification, self-dramatization, and legacy building. Panzram may have exaggerated aspects of his personality, just as he may have exaggerated aspects of his criminal history. Yet even allowing for possible exaggeration, the consistency of his language leaves little doubt that hatred formed a central component of the identity he wished to present. During these same years, his documented criminal behavior continued. Burglaries, robberies, assaults, and prison escapes remained recurring features of his life. The philosophy expressed in his memoir, therefore, cannot be separated entirely from observable conduct. Although historians distinguish carefully between verified crimes and unverified confessions, there is no dispute that Panzram repeatedly violated the law over decades and spent much of his adult life incarcerated. His worldview and his actions appeared to reinforce one another. Each arrest strengthened his resentment. Each prison sentence deepened his hostility. Each release was followed by new offenses that ensured the cycle would continue. It is tempting to search for moments when Carl Panzram might have changed direction. Could a different childhood have altered his future? Could effective rehabilitation have interrupted his criminal path? Could compassionate intervention have prevented later violence? Such questions remain impossible to answer. History records only what occurred, not the countless alternatives that never happened. What the available evidence demonstrates is that every major institution that entered Panzram's life, family discipline, juvenile reform, the military, prisons, and the criminal justice system, ultimately failed to redirect him toward a lawful existence. By the early 1920s, his hostility had become inseparable from his identity. That hatred would soon intersect with one of the most remarkable crimes documented in his life. In 1920, Carl Panzram committed a burglary unlike any of his previous offenses. Rather than targeting an anonymous business or private residence, he broke into the home of former President William Howard Taft in New Haven, Connecticut. Historical records confirm that he escaped with cash, jewelry, bonds, a commemorative watch, and one particularly significant item, a Colt pistol belonging to the former president. Years later, Panzram claimed that the money stolen during that burglary allowed him to purchase a small yacht named Akista. According to his own confessions, that vessel would become the setting for a series of murders committed far from witnesses and beyond the reach of immediate investigation. Whether every detail of those confessions was true remains one of the greatest historical uncertainties surrounding Carl Panzram. Yet the Taft burglary marked a clear turning point. Until then, his documented history was largely that of an itinerant burglar and habitual offender. Afterward, according to his own writings, his crimes escalated into a level of violence that would define his enduring notoriety. The next chapter of his life would carry him away from crowded cities and prison cells onto open water, where fact and confession would become more difficult to separate than ever before. By 1920, Carl Panzram had already established himself as a persistent and highly mobile career criminal. Years of burglaries, robberies, assaults, prison sentences, and escapes had hardened him into a man who appeared incapable of living within the boundaries of the law for any meaningful length of time. His life followed a familiar rhythm. He traveled from one place to another, committed crimes whenever opportunities presented themselves, disappeared before authorities could fully connect him to previous offenses, and eventually resurfaced in yet another jail or prison. Yet among the many crimes recorded during this period, one burglary stands apart from the rest because of the prominence of its victim and the role it would later play in Panzram's own account of his life. According to historical records, in September 1920, Carl Panzram broke into the home of former President William Howard Taft in New Haven, Connecticut. Unlike many of his previous burglaries, this was not the residence of an anonymous citizen or a small business owner. William Howard Taft had served as the 27th President of the United States before later becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, making him one of the most recognizable public figures in the country. Although Taft was no longer serving as president at the time of the burglary, his name carried enormous national significance. The theft therefore attracted attention not only because of the property stolen, but because it demonstrated that even the home of a former president was not beyond the reach of an experienced burglar. Historical sources confirm that Panzram escaped with several valuable items. Among them were cash, jewelry, bonds, a commemorative watch, and a Colt pistol belonging to Taft. Each object represented immediate financial value to an experienced thief. But the pistol would later assume far greater importance within Panzram's own narrative. Years afterward, while writing his prison memoir, he claimed that this weapon accompanied him during some of the most disturbing crimes he ever confessed to committing. As with many elements of Panzram's autobiography, historians distinguish carefully between the burglary itself, which is well documented, and his later descriptions of how the stolen pistol was used. Those later claims remain tied primarily to his own testimony rather than independent evidence. The burglary also provided something else that Panzram had long sought: money. According to his memoir, the proceeds from the Taft burglary enabled him to purchase a small yacht named Akista. This modest sailing vessel would become central to one of the darkest chapters in his confessions. Unlike freight trains or temporary lodging houses, a private boat offered mobility, privacy, and isolation. It allowed him to move along the northeastern coastline while remaining largely beyond the constant scrutiny he faced on land. Whether he recognized these advantages before purchasing the vessel or only later is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Akista occupied a prominent place in his own account of his criminal career. Panzram later described the purchase of the yacht almost matter-of-factly, presenting it as another practical step in his life of crime. There was little indication in his writings that he viewed the burglary itself as extraordinary, despite the prominence of its victim. To him, William Howard Taft represented another opportunity rather than a symbol of political power. In fact, Panzram claimed that he harbored particular resentment toward Taft because he blamed government institutions for much of his own suffering. He suggested that his hatred extended to political leaders whom he believed represented those institutions. Whether this explanation reflected genuine motivation or was simply another retrospective interpretation cannot be established with certainty. Nevertheless, it illustrates how thoroughly his personal philosophy had become intertwined with his criminal behavior. The acquisition of Akista marked a significant shift in the environment in which Panzram claimed many of his later crimes occurred. Instead of relying solely on trains to move across the country, he now possessed a vessel capable of carrying him along coastal waters. Harbors, docks, waterfront taverns, and maritime communities became recurring settings in the stories preserved within his memoir. According to his own account, these locations provided opportunities to encounter sailors, laborers, and transients whose disappearances might attract less immediate attention than crimes committed in crowded cities. Here, however, the historical record becomes far less certain. The crimes Panzram later associated with Akista rely overwhelmingly upon his own confessions. Investigators found no series of recovered bodies corresponding to the killings he described. No surviving police investigations conclusively linked multiple disappearances to his yacht. Historians therefore emphasize that while the existence of Akista and the Taft burglary are documented, the alleged murders committed aboard the vessel remain largely unverified. This distinction is essential. Responsible historical analysis separates proven events from claims that cannot be independently confirmed, regardless of how frequently those claims have been repeated in popular culture. According to Panzram's memoir, his routine followed a chilling pattern. He claimed that he frequented waterfront bars near New York, where sailors gathered after returning from voyages. There he would begin conversations by drinks and gradually gain the trust of men who believed they had simply met another traveler. Alcohol played a central role in these encounters. Panzram described inviting sailors aboard a kista to continue drinking in greater privacy. The small yacht, isolated from crowded taverns and hidden by darkness on the water, provided a setting where witnesses were unlikely. At this point in his account, Panzram alleged that the encounters turned violently criminal. He claimed that after his guests became intoxicated, he sexually assaulted them, shot them using the Colt pistol stolen from Taft's residence, and disposed of their bodies by throwing them into the waters of Long Island Sound. According to his confession, approximately 10 sailors died in this manner. These descriptions have become some of the most widely quoted passages in discussions of Carl Panzram's life because they portray calculated violence carried out in near-total isolation. Yet they also illustrate the greatest challenge confronting historians. No recovered bodies have conclusively supported these confessions. No surviving investigative files establish that 10 sailors disappeared under circumstances matching Panzram's narrative. Maritime disappearances were unfortunately not uncommon during the early 20th century, particularly among transient seamen whose movements often went undocumented. That reality neither proves nor disproves Panzram's claims. It simply explains why investigators have never been able to verify them with confidence. Some researchers believe portions of his account may be truthful precisely because certain details appear plausible within the historical context of transient maritime life. Others argue that Panzram may have exaggerated the scale of his crimes, combining real offenses with fabricated ones to construct the terrifying legacy he wished to leave behind. The available evidence does not permit a definitive conclusion. Throughout this story, the distinction between verified history and personal confession remains essential. The uncertainty surrounding Akista is therefore not a weakness in the historical record but one of its defining features. It forces historians to confront the limits of evidence while acknowledging the possibility that some crimes may never be fully reconstructed. Whether the number of victims was exactly as Panzram claimed, fewer than he claimed, or entirely fabricated in some instances, cannot now be established. The waters of Long Island Sound reveal little after the passage of decades, and the men Panzram described were often individuals whose disappearances might have passed unnoticed beyond the communities that briefly knew them. What can be established is that the Taft burglary provided Panzram with both financial resources and a vessel that occupied a central place in his own account of escalating violence. The transition from burglar to self-confessed serial killer, at least in his memoir, begins with Akista. The boat represented mobility, privacy, and freedom from immediate observation. It also symbolized the widening gap between crimes documented by law enforcement and crimes described only by the man accused of committing them. For historians, this period marks the beginning of Carl Panzram's transformation from a habitual offender into one of the most controversial figures in American criminal history. Every subsequent confession would raise the same difficult question: where does documented fact end? And where does Carl Panzram's own narrative begin? That question would become even more complicated when his travels allegedly carried him far beyond the shores of the United States to Portuguese Angola, where he later described crimes so horrifying that even today they remain among the least verifiable episodes of his entire life. According to Carl Panzram's own account, the purchase of the yacht Akista marked the beginning of one of the darkest periods of his life. If his confessions were entirely accurate, the small sailing vessel became more than a means of transportation. It became the setting for repeated acts of calculated violence carried out far from witnesses and beyond the immediate reach of law enforcement. Yet unlike the burglary of former President William Howard Taft's home, which is supported by historical records, nearly everything that follows comes primarily from Panzram's own writings. This distinction cannot be overstated. Throughout the study of Carl Panzram's life, historians repeatedly separate documented events from personal confessions that have never been independently verified. The alleged murders committed aboard Akista remain among the most controversial examples of that divide. In his prison memoir, Panzram described a routine that he claimed to have repeated numerous times along the northeastern coast of the United States. He wrote that he spent evenings visiting waterfront taverns where merchant sailors gathered after long voyages. Such establishments were busy places filled with men who often had no permanent home in the cities, where their ships temporarily docked. Crews arrived from distant ports, spent their wages on food and alcohol, and then disappeared again with the next voyage. Many were strangers to one another. They came and went without leaving extensive personal records behind. According to Panzram, this transient world offered him the anonymity he believed he needed. He claimed that he approached sailors casually, beginning ordinary conversations over drinks. Nothing in his account suggested dramatic confrontations or elaborate deception. Instead, he described presenting himself as another traveler with access to a private boat where the evening could continue away from crowded bars. Alcohol, according to his own narrative, became an essential part of the plan. He alleged that he encouraged his guests to drink heavily before inviting them aboard a kista, anchored in the waters near New York and Long Island Sound. The invitation would have appeared harmless. Spending time aboard a small yacht was hardly unusual in busy coastal communities where sailors and waterfront workers often socialized after returning from sea. Once aboard, however, Panzram claimed that the atmosphere changed completely. According to his confession, after the sailors became intoxicated, he restrained them, sexually assaulted them, and then shot them using the Colt pistol stolen during the burglary of William Howard Taft's residence. He further claimed that he disposed of each body by throwing it into the surrounding waters, believing that currents, marine life, and the passage of time would erase any evidence linking the deaths to him. In his memoir, he estimated that approximately 10 sailors died in this manner. The simplicity of the method, if true, was precisely what made it so difficult to investigate decades later. There were allegedly no surviving witnesses, no preserved crime scenes, and no recovered bodies that could be conclusively connected to his account. Long Island Sound, stretching between Connecticut and Long Island, is a vast body of water with busy shipping lanes and changing tides. During the early 20th century, maritime disappearances were not unheard of. Sailors sometimes vanished during storms, accidents, or while traveling between ports. Record keeping varied widely, particularly for transient laborers moving from one ship to another. Panzram appeared to believe that these circumstances made the sea an ideal place to conceal homicide. Whether he actually carried out the crimes exactly as described remains one of the greatest unanswered questions surrounding his life. Historians have spent decades comparing his confessions with available records, searching for disappearances, police reports, and other evidence that might support or contradict his narrative. Despite those efforts, no series of recovered victims has been identified that conclusively matches the murders he claimed occurred aboard a kista. Likewise, no surviving investigation has established beyond reasonable doubt that approximately 10 sailors disappeared under circumstances corresponding to his account. This absence of evidence has led scholars to approach these confessions with considerable caution. Some researchers argue that portions of the story may contain elements of truth. They point out that Panzram accurately described many aspects of his documented criminal life elsewhere in his memoir, suggesting that not every confession should automatically be dismissed. Others believe he exaggerated the scale of his violence, perhaps combining isolated real crimes with fictional ones in order to reinforce the terrifying reputation he wished to leave behind. The available historical evidence supports neither complete acceptance nor complete rejection of his claims. Instead, it leaves historians in an uncomfortable position where uncertainty itself becomes part of the narrative. The difficulty of verifying maritime crimes also reflects the investigative limitations of the era. During the 1920s, forensic science remained in its early stages. There were no national databases capable of instantly connecting disappearances across different jurisdictions. Communication between police departments was slower and less comprehensive than it is today. Even if several sailors had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, investigators might never have recognized a broader pattern, particularly if the victims came from different ships, different cities, or different countries. Panzram's own history as a transient criminal demonstrated how effectively mobility could frustrate law enforcement. His alleged crimes at sea, if committed, would have benefited from many of the same weaknesses. Yet responsible historical analysis demands more than plausibility. Possibility alone cannot replace evidence. That is why modern biographies consistently distinguish between the verified burglary that allowed Panzram to purchase a kista and the murders he later claimed to have committed aboard it. The former is documented through historical records. The latter survives primarily through his own words. Throughout his memoir, Panzram rarely attempted to justify these alleged killings. He did not claim self-defense, financial necessity, or personal revenge against the sailors. Instead, the crimes fit the broader philosophy expressed elsewhere in his writings. He repeatedly insisted that he hated humanity as a whole and viewed violence as both inevitable and desirable. If his account is accepted at face value, the victims were selected largely because opportunity presented itself rather than because of any personal connection. Such apparent randomness contributes to the disturbing nature of his confessions. At the same time, it also complicates verification. Victims chosen opportunistically from transient populations leave fewer obvious investigative trails than crimes involving family members, acquaintances, or established communities. One of the striking features of Panzram's writing is its emotional detachment. When describing these alleged murders, he offered little reflection on the lives of the victims. There is virtually no acknowledgement of their families, aspirations, or futures. They appear only briefly before disappearing from the narrative entirely. This absence serves as a reminder that while Carl Panzram's memoir remains an important historical document, it reflects almost exclusively the perspective of the perpetrator. The individuals he claimed to have harmed remain largely invisible within his own account. Their stories, if the crimes occurred, were never preserved by the man who confessed to ending them. For that reason, modern examinations of Panzram's life emphasize the importance of remembering the distinction between the notoriety of the offender and the humanity of those who may have suffered because of him. Whether there were 10 victims, fewer victims, or none matching this particular confession, the uncertainty itself represents a profound historical loss. Without evidence, names cannot be restored, families cannot receive definitive answers, and the historical record remains incomplete. As investigators continued to evaluate Panzram's extraordinary claims, another chapter of his confession attracted even greater skepticism. He wrote that his travels eventually took him beyond the United States to Portuguese Angola, where he worked near an oil operation. There, according to his own account, he committed additional murders under circumstances even more difficult to investigate than those allegedly carried out aboard a kista. The remote location, the passage of time, and the absence of surviving records created an almost insurmountable barrier to historical verification. If the confessions concerning Long Island Sound occupied the uncertain boundary between evidence and memory, the events Panzram later described in Angola would push that boundary even further, leaving historians to confront one of the most controversial and least verifiable episodes in the life of a man whose own words continue to challenge the limits of historical certainty. If the alleged murders aboard a kista occupy one of the most uncertain chapters in Carl Panzram's life, then his claims about crimes committed in Portuguese Angola move even further into territory where historical verification becomes extraordinarily difficult. These confessions have long fascinated researchers because of their shocking nature. Yet they also represent some of the least substantiated statements contained in his prison memoir. Nearly everything known about this period comes directly from Panzram's own writings. unlike his documented burglary of William Howard Taft's residence or the later murder committed inside Leavenworth Penitentiary. The events he described in Angola are not supported by surviving investigative records capable of confirming his account. For that reason, historians consistently emphasize that these allegations remain claims rather than established historical facts. According to his memoir, Panzram eventually traveled beyond the United States and found employment at an oil operation in Portuguese Angola, a territory that is today the independent nation of Angola. During the early 20th century, European colonial powers maintained extensive control over parts of Africa, and laborers from many different backgrounds could be found working in industries connected to shipping, trade, and resource extraction. Panzram presented this period of his life as another chapter in his continual movement from place to place. Throughout adulthood, he rarely remained in one location for long. Whether traveling by freight train, ship, or yacht, he appeared constantly in search of new opportunities, lawful or otherwise. His own account suggests that Angola became one more destination in that restless existence. It is important to remember, however, that the historical record surrounding his presence there is far less complete than records documenting his criminal activities within the United States. Even before considering the crimes he later confessed to, reconstructing his precise movements abroad presents significant challenges. According to Panzram, his work near the oil operation placed him close to rivers and waterways that became central to his subsequent confessions. In his memoir, he claimed that he lured young boys onto a boat under false pretenses. Once isolated from others, he alleged that he sexually assaulted them before shooting them and disposing of their bodies in rivers inhabited by crocodiles. He wrote that the animals would eliminate evidence, ensuring that neither bodies nor identifiable remains would ever be recovered. These descriptions are among the most disturbing passages in Killer, a Journal of Murder. They have frequently been cited in books and documentaries discussing Panzram's life because they appear to illustrate both calculated planning and extraordinary brutality. Yet they also illustrate the limits of historical certainty. No surviving investigation has confirmed these alleged murders. No known victims have been conclusively identified through independent evidence. No court ever tried Panzram for these crimes. Historians therefore continue to distinguish sharply between what Panzram claimed and what available records actually demonstrate. The absence of corroborating evidence has produced several competing interpretations among researchers. Some believe that portions of the confession may describe genuine events that simply cannot be reconstructed after the passage of so much time. Colonial records from remote regions were often incomplete, and crimes committed against vulnerable populations sometimes received little formal investigation. Others argue that Panzram exaggerated or even invented aspects of his overseas experiences in order to reinforce the image of himself as a man capable of limitless violence. Because both possibilities remain plausible, neither can be accepted as definitive history. This uncertainty has become one of the defining characteristics of nearly every serious study of Carl Panzram. His autobiography remains indispensable because it provides extensive first-hand testimony. At the same time, historians recognize that first-hand testimony, particularly from an individual who repeatedly embraced violence and showed no remorse, cannot replace independent verification. The confessions concerning Angola also fit a broader pattern visible throughout Panzram's memoir. Again and again, he portrayed mobility as one of his greatest advantages. Constant travel made it more difficult for authorities to connect crimes committed in different places. Working in distant regions further reduced the likelihood that investigators in the United States would ever become aware of offenses allegedly committed overseas. If Panzram truly believed that geographic isolation protected him from accountability, then Angola represented the most extreme example of that strategy. On the other hand, if portions of the memoir were intentionally exaggerated, selecting such a remote setting also made contradiction exceptionally difficult. Few readers in the United States during the late 1920s possessed detailed knowledge of conditions in Portuguese Angola or access to records that might challenge his narrative. Another striking aspect of these confessions is the absence of identifiable victims. Unlike the later confirmed killing of newspaper boy Alexander Usyk, whose name appears in historical records, the children described in Angola remain anonymous within Panzram's own account. Their identities, families, and personal histories are absent from the narrative. This absence creates a profound moral challenge when discussing the case. Even if the crimes cannot be verified, the possibility that vulnerable children may have suffered remains deeply unsettling. At the same time, historical integrity requires acknowledging that possibility without presenting speculation as established fact. Responsible true crime storytelling depends upon preserving that distinction. The available evidence allows historians to state only that Panzram confessed to these acts. It does not allow them to conclude that every detail occurred exactly as described. Throughout his memoir, Panzram offered remarkably little emotional reflection on the individuals he claimed to have harmed. He rarely described conversations, relationships, or personal interactions beyond what was necessary to recount the alleged offenses. The victims appeared primarily as opportunities rather than as human beings with independent lives. This emotional distance is consistent with the broader tone of his writings, which repeatedly emphasize contempt for humanity as a whole. Yet even within that detached narrative, the silence surrounding the victims is striking. If the events occurred, entire lives disappeared into history without names or documented remembrance. If they did not occur, the confessions themselves nevertheless reveal the disturbing identity Panzram sought to construct through his writing. In either case, the memoir continues to challenge readers not only because of the violence it describes, but because of the uncertainty it preserves. Historians have also noted that Panzram's Angola confessions illustrate the broader methodological difficulties involved in studying serial offenders who operated during the early 20th century. Modern criminal investigations benefit from forensic science, centralized databases, international cooperation, and extensive record-keeping. None of those systems existed in comparable form during Panzram's lifetime. Investigators attempting to evaluate crimes allegedly committed across multiple states, and even across continents, faced enormous practical obstacles. Many records have been lost. Witnesses died long ago. Physical evidence, if it ever existed, has disappeared. Consequently, some questions surrounding Carl Panzram may never receive definitive answers regardless of future research. The uncertainty is not merely the result of incomplete scholarship. It reflects the irreversible passage of time itself. Despite these limitations, one conclusion remains firmly supported by the historical record. Carl Panzram deliberately presented himself as a man whose violence recognized no geographic boundaries. Whether traveling through American cities, sailing coastal waters, or working abroad, his memoir consistently depicts crime as the central organizing principle of his life. Geography changed, but his self-described philosophy did not. He continued to portray himself as someone driven by hatred toward humanity and indifferent to the suffering of others. That consistency has contributed significantly to his enduring notoriety, even as historians continue to debate the factual accuracy of many specific confessions. Eventually, however, Panzram's years of constant movement came to an end. After decades spent drifting across the United States and beyond, committing documented crimes alongside numerous alleged offenses, his freedom ended not because investigators solved a complex murder case, but because of a comparatively ordinary property crime. In 1928, authorities in Baltimore arrested him for burglary. At first, there was little reason to believe this arrest differed from the many others scattered throughout his criminal record. Yet during the investigation that followed, something unexpected occurred. Without being accused of numerous murders, Carl Panzram began confessing to them himself. What initially appeared to be another routine burglary investigation soon evolved into one of the most remarkable confession cases in American criminal history, forcing investigators to confront claims so extensive that separating truth from invention would become one of the greatest challenges of the entire case. By 1928, Carl Panzram had spent more than 2 decades moving through a world defined by crime, imprisonment, and escape. His name appeared in records connected to theft, burglary, robbery, assault, and repeated conflicts with the authorities. Yet despite the extraordinary length of his criminal career, law enforcement had never fully understood the scale of the violence he would later claim to have committed. Many of his alleged crimes remained hidden behind distant missing records and the limitations of early 20th century investigations. To police officers who encountered him during this period, he was primarily a dangerous habitual offender, a man who repeatedly violated the law and repeatedly returned to prison. They did not yet know that the prisoner in front of them would soon provide one of the most disturbing series of confessions in American criminal history. The event that finally brought Panzram into custody occurred in 1928 in Baltimore, Maryland. According to historical records, he was arrested for burglary connected to a theft committed in Washington, D.C. At first glance, the case appeared to be another ordinary property crime in an already extensive criminal record. There was no immediate indication that investigators were dealing with a man who would later claim responsibility for multiple murders across different locations. There was no known connection at that moment between the burglary suspect and the violent stories that would eventually define his reputation. The investigation began like many other criminal cases of the era. Authorities focused on the evidence surrounding the theft, attempting to establish what had happened and who was responsible. Yet during questioning, Panzram began to speak about far more than the burglary. Instead of limiting himself to the immediate accusation, he began revealing details about a life filled with crimes far beyond what investigators expected. He described robberies, assaults, sexual violence, and killings that he claimed had occurred over many years. For investigators, these statements created a difficult situation. Confessions of extraordinary crimes are not automatically accepted as truth, especially when they come from a person known for criminal behavior and a desire to challenge authority. Police had to determine whether Panzram was revealing genuine information, exaggerating his importance, or inventing stories for reasons of his own. The problem was made even more complicated by the scale of his claims. He did not confess to one isolated act of violence. He claimed responsibility for a pattern of crimes extending across multiple states and even outside the United States. According to his statements, he had murdered 21 people. He claimed to have committed more than 1,000 sexual assaults against men and boys. He also suggested that the number of victims might have been far higher than anyone could prove. Such claims were almost impossible to investigate completely, particularly given the time period. Modern investigators rely heavily on forensic technology, digital databases, and extensive communication networks between law enforcement agencies. In the 1920s, police departments operated with far fewer resources. Information traveled slowly. Records were often incomplete. Crimes committed in different jurisdictions were not always connected. A person who moved constantly, as Panzram had done for years, could leave behind a scattered trail that was extremely difficult to reconstruct. Nevertheless, investigators did not simply dismiss his statements. They began comparing elements of his confessions with known records and previous cases. Some details appeared consistent with documented events, while others remained impossible to verify. This mixture of accuracy and uncertainty would become a defining feature of the Panzram case. He was not simply a criminal making random claims. Some parts of his story matched reality, which meant investigators had to take his words seriously. At the same time, the absence of evidence for many other claims prevented them from accepting everything without question. Among the crimes Panzram discussed were alleged murders involving sailors, children, and victims in different locations. He spoke openly about acts that, if true, would have made him one of the most prolific killers in American history. Yet the challenge for authorities was that confession alone could not answer every question. A statement from the offender could provide direction for an investigation, but it could not replace physical evidence, identified victims, or independent witnesses. The more Panzram talked, the larger the mystery became. He presented himself not as someone seeking forgiveness, but as someone determined to reveal the full extent of his hatred and violence. His attitude shocked many who encountered him. Most offenders, even those convicted of serious crimes, often attempt to minimize responsibility, deny involvement, or seek sympathy. Panzram did the opposite. He appeared willing, even eager, to describe himself as a person capable of extreme cruelty. Whether this reflected genuine honesty, a desire for notoriety, or a combination of both remains debated. What is clear is that his statements changed the way authorities viewed him. He was no longer simply a burglar. He had become a suspect in a far broader range of possible crimes. As investigators continued examining his claims, they encountered another challenge: determining which confessions could be supported. Some crimes he described had no surviving records that could be located. Others involved victims whose identities were uncertain. Some allegations concerned distant places where documentation was incomplete or unavailable. This problem would continue throughout the remainder of the investigation and beyond his lifetime. The line between confirmed history and Panzram's own narrative remained blurred. One of the most significant aspects of this period was the emergence of his written account. While imprisoned, Panzram would eventually document his life story with the assistance of prison guard Henry Lesser. However, before that memoir became available to the public, investigators already had access to his extraordinary verbal confessions. The man who stood before them seemed determined to ensure that his crimes would not disappear into forgotten records. He wanted his story known, even if that story portrayed him as one of the most violent criminals of his time. In some ways, this desire for recognition was consistent with his lifelong relationship with authority. He had spent years fighting against prisons, police, and legal systems. Now, instead of hiding from those systems, he was voluntarily providing information that could lead to additional charges. It was an unusual behavior that confused many observers. Why would someone confess to crimes that might result in harsher punishment? For Panzram, the answer appeared connected to his worldview. He did not seem interested in avoiding consequences. In fact, he repeatedly expressed a desire for death rather than continued imprisonment. He viewed life in prison as another form of suffering and saw execution as the ultimate conclusion to his conflict with society. Following his arrest and the revelations that emerged afterward, Panzram was eventually transferred into the federal prison system. He was sentenced to a long prison term and sent to the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. There, behind thick walls and strict security, his story would take another dark turn. Prison officials recognized him as an exceptionally dangerous inmate. His history of escapes, violence, and defiance made him a serious security concern. Yet even within Leavenworth, where some of America's most dangerous offenders were confined, Carl Panzram would continue to demonstrate the same hostility that had followed him throughout his life. The next major event would not involve an unsolved murder or a hidden confession. It would happen inside the prison itself, when Panzram committed another act of violence that ensured he would face the ultimate punishment. On June 20th, 1929, less than a year after his arrival at Leavenworth, he killed prison employee Robert Warnke. This final act of violence would determine the course of his remaining days and lead directly to his execution. But before that final chapter unfolded, the prison would also become the place where one person attempted to understand the man behind the crimes. That person was Henry Lesser, a prison guard whose unusual decision to treat Panzram with basic human respect resulted in the creation of one of the most important criminal memoirs ever written. When Carl Panzram arrived at the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas in 1928, He entered a prison system already familiar with men who had committed serious crimes. Leavenworth was one of the most significant federal prisons in the country, designed to contain offenders considered dangerous to society. Yet even among a population of convicted criminals, Panzram stood out. His history of escapes, assaults, repeated imprisonment, and his own extraordinary confessions made him a prisoner who inspired concern among officials. He was not simply another inmate serving a sentence. He was a man who had spent much of his life challenging every institution that attempted to control him. For prison authorities, the central problem was not only what crimes he had committed in the past, but what he might do in the future. By this stage of his life, Panzram had developed a reputation for refusing cooperation. Prison, which was intended to restrict behavior through discipline and confinement, had never succeeded in changing his attitude toward authority. Instead, his years behind bars appeared to intensify his resentment. He viewed guards, administrators, and the entire prison system as representatives of a society he believed had mistreated him since childhood. His arrival at Leavenworth, therefore, did not represent a period of reflection or rehabilitation. It represented another confrontation between Carl Panzram and the institutions he hated. According to accounts from this period, Panzram immediately made his position clear. He did not present himself as a prisoner seeking forgiveness or improvement. Instead, he continued expressing hostility and defiance. Prison officials considered him extremely dangerous and took precautions accordingly. He was separated from many other inmates and assigned work arrangements designed to reduce opportunities for conflict. One of these assignments placed him in the prison laundry area, where he worked with limited contact with the general prison population. However, isolation did not eliminate the violence that had followed him throughout his life. On June 20th, 1929, less than a year after his arrival at Leavenworth, Panzram committed the final known killing of his life. The victim was Robert Warnke, a prison employee who worked at the institution. According to historical records, Panzram attacked Warnke with a metal bar, striking him repeatedly and causing fatal injuries. The exact circumstances surrounding the conflict between the two men have been discussed in historical accounts, but the outcome was clear. A prison worker had been killed by an inmate already considered exceptionally dangerous. After the attack, Panzram did not attempt to create a complicated defense. He did not deny responsibility or claim that the event had been an accident. Instead, his attitude remained consistent with the pattern seen throughout his life. He accepted the consequences and appeared to welcome the possibility of execution. For Panzram, death had become preferable to continued imprisonment. This response shocked many observers because it demonstrated a complete rejection of the normal motivations that influence defendants facing severe punishment. Most people confronted with a possible death sentence attempt to delay it, challenge evidence, or seek mercy. Panzram did not appear interested in those options. His writings and statements suggested that he viewed his own execution as an inevitable conclusion, rather than something to avoid. While the murder of Robert Warnke would ultimately determine his fate, another important development occurred during Panzram's time at Leavenworth. It was here that he met Henry Lesser, a prison guard whose approach toward him differed significantly from that of many other officials. Rather than treating Panzram only as a dangerous offender, Lesser attempted to interact with him as a human being. This decision would have a lasting impact on how the world later understood Carl Panzram. Henry Lesser was not a famous investigator, psychologist, or author. He was simply a prison employee who believed that even the most difficult individuals deserved basic respect. According to historical accounts, Lesser provided Panzram with cigarettes and writing materials. He encouraged him to record his memories and experiences. At first, this may have seemed like a simple gesture, but it created something historically significant. For the first time, Panzram had an opportunity to tell his story in his own words. The result was a lengthy manuscript that later became known as Killer, a journal of murder. The relationship between Lesser and Panzram is one of the most unusual aspects of the entire case. It did not represent friendship in the ordinary sense. Lesser did not approve of Panzram's crimes, and he did not excuse the suffering caused by his actions. Instead, he appeared motivated by a desire to understand the person behind the crimes. For historians, this manuscript became an invaluable source because it provided direct insight into Panzram's thoughts, memories, and self-perception. However, the same qualities that make the document valuable also create challenges. The memoir is written entirely from Panzram's perspective. It contains his explanations, his interpretations, and his claims about events that cannot always be independently verified. Therefore, while it is one of the most important sources on his life, it must also be approached carefully. Throughout the manuscript, Panzram discussed his childhood, his experiences in institutions, his years as a criminal, and the crimes he claimed to have committed. He wrote openly about his hatred of humanity and his refusal to express remorse. Unlike many prisoners who attempt to present themselves in a more favorable light, Panzram seemed determined to portray himself as someone consumed by anger and violence. This made the manuscript both fascinating and disturbing. It revealed not only information about his crimes, but also the way he wanted history to remember him. The document also reinforced one of the central difficulties surrounding Panzram's legacy: separating fact from self-created mythology. Some elements of his writing correspond with known events. His criminal record, imprisonment history, burglary of Taft's home, and killing of Robert Warnke are supported by historical evidence. Other statements, particularly those involving large numbers of victims, remain impossible to confirm. The memoir therefore exists in a complicated space between confession and personal narrative. It is neither something historians can simply dismiss, nor something they can accept without examination. As Panzram continued writing, he showed no indication that his beliefs had changed. There was no transformation, no expression of regret, and no attempt to rebuild a moral connection with the world. Instead, his words continued to reflect the same bitterness that had appeared throughout his adult life. He described himself as someone permanently separated from society, someone who had rejected humanity as much as he believed humanity had rejected him. For some researchers, these writings provide a window into the mind of a deeply violent offender. For others, they represent the final attempt of a man facing execution to control the narrative surrounding his own life. Both interpretations recognize the same reality. Panzram understood the power of his story. He knew that by writing, he could influence how future generations viewed him. Whether he sought condemnation, fear, or simply recognition, he ensured that his name would not disappear after his death. As the legal process following the murder of Robert Warnke moved forward, there was little doubt about the outcome. Panzram had killed a prison employee while already serving a lengthy sentence. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he did not appear interested in avoiding punishment. The court proceedings would eventually result in a death sentence, bringing him closer to the fate he had repeatedly said he wanted. Yet, even as his execution approached, Carl Panzram remained consistent with the image he had created throughout his life. He showed no public remorse and no desire for forgiveness. Instead, he continued to challenge the world around him until the very end. The final chapter of his life would come on September 5, 1930, when Carl Panzram was taken to the gallows at Leavenworth, Kansas. There, the life of one of America's most controversial and violent criminals came to an end. But the questions surrounding him did not end with his death. Decades later, historians would continue examining the same unresolved issues. How many victims were real? How many existed only in his confessions? And how much of Carl Panzram's terrifying legacy was created by the crimes he committed versus the story he chose to tell? By the summer of 1930, Carl Panzram had reached the final stage of a life defined by violence, imprisonment, and defiance. For nearly 3 decades, he had moved through the United States and beyond, leaving behind a record of theft, burglary, assault, escape, and multiple claims of murder. Some of those claims were supported by evidence, while many others remained impossible to verify. Yet regardless of the uncertainty surrounding the full extent of his crimes, there was no question that Panzram had become one of the most dangerous offenders known to American authorities during his era. His final days at the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, were not marked by regret or attempts to seek forgiveness. Instead, they continued the same pattern that had defined his entire adult life: resistance, hostility, and rejection of the society that had imprisoned him. The murder of prison employee Robert Warnke on June 20th, 1929, had determined his fate. Panzram had already been serving a lengthy prison sentence when he attacked Warnke with a metal bar, killing him inside the prison. Unlike many defendants facing execution, he did not attempt to deny what had happened. He did not build a defense based on innocence, misunderstanding, or self-preservation. Historical accounts indicate that he accepted responsibility and openly expressed his desire to receive the death penalty. For Panzram, another life sentence represented continued confinement in a system he despised. Execution, in his view, was the final escape from a world he believed had been hostile from the beginning. This attitude remained consistent with the philosophy expressed throughout his prison writings. He had repeatedly stated that he hated humanity and had little connection to the values that most people use to define society: compassion, forgiveness, responsibility, and rehabilitation. His refusal to show remorse became one of the most discussed aspects of his personality. Many criminals attempt to explain their actions, ask for understanding, or present themselves as victims of circumstances. Panzram did something different. He emphasized his own brutality. He wanted people to know what he had done and how he viewed the world. Whether this represented complete honesty or an attempt to create a terrifying image is still debated by historians. However, the effect was undeniable. He transformed himself into a figure who remained controversial long after his death. During his final period in prison, the relationship between Panzram and Henry Lesser remained one of the most significant elements of his story. The prison guard who had provided him with writing materials had helped create a document unlike almost any other criminal autobiography of the period. The manuscript that emerged from their interactions eventually became known as Killer, a journal of murder. This work preserved Panzram's thoughts, memories, and confessions, providing future researchers with direct access to his own voice. Yet the same document that made him historically important also created major challenges. A confession written by the person accused of committing crimes is valuable, but it cannot automatically be treated as complete historical truth. Throughout the memoir, Panzram described numerous murders and acts of violence, including crimes for which no independent evidence has been found. He claimed to have killed 21 people, committed more than 1,000 sexual assaults, and possibly caused many more deaths than investigators could prove. However, only a small number of victims have been confirmed through available evidence. This difference between confession and verification remains central to every serious examination of his life. The question is not simply whether Panzram was violent. He unquestionably was. The question is how much of the enormous scale of violence he described actually occurred. Historians continue to approach his claims with caution because the available evidence does not support accepting every statement without examination. At the same time, they cannot ignore the fact that some of his confessions corresponded with known crimes. This combination of truth and uncertainty is what makes Panzram's case so difficult. He was neither easily dismissed as a liar nor fully confirmed as the architect of every crime he claimed. On September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram was executed by hanging at Leavenworth, Kansas. According to historical accounts, he remained defiant until the end. He did not offer a final expression of remorse, nor did he attempt to portray himself as deserving of sympathy. The execution brought an end to the physical life of a man who had spent years fighting against confinement. But it did not end the questions surrounding him. Instead, his death marked the beginning of a different kind of existence, one as a subject of historical study, criminal analysis, and public fascination. The legacy of Carl Panzram remains complicated because it contains two separate realities that must always be considered together. The first reality is the documented criminal record. Panzram was a repeat offender who committed serious crimes over many years. He stole, assaulted people, escaped custody, and killed Robert Warnke inside prison. He also committed crimes connected to burglary and robbery that are supported by historical records. These facts alone place him among the most dangerous criminals of his era. The second reality is the collection of confessions he left behind. These statements created the image of Panzram as a possible mass murderer responsible for dozens of killings across different locations. However, many of those claims remain unproven. A careful understanding of his life requires recognizing both realities without confusing them. Over time, criminologists and historians have examined Panzram as an example of extreme criminal behavior. His childhood experiences, including the abuse he claimed to have suffered at the Minnesota State Training School, are often discussed as part of the broader context of his development. Researchers have considered how early violence, repeated imprisonment, and social isolation may have influenced his worldview. However, they also emphasize that difficult experiences alone do not explain or excuse later crimes. Many people endure hardship without becoming violent offenders. Panzram's choices and actions remain his own responsibility. His story also raises broader questions about the criminal justice systems of his time. He passed through numerous institutions, including juvenile reform facilities, military structures, and prisons. Yet none of these systems successfully changed his behavior or prevented future violence. His repeated escapes and continued offending demonstrate the limitations of early 20th century approaches to dealing with extremely dangerous individuals. At the same time, the existence of Henry Lesser's relationship with him shows another important point. Even someone responsible for terrible crimes could still be observed, studied, and treated as a human being without minimizing the suffering he caused. That distinction is important when examining historical criminals. Understanding an offender does not mean excusing the offender. Studying the mind behind violent acts is not an attempt to reduce responsibility. Instead, it allows society to examine how such crimes occur and how future harm might be prevented. Carl Panzram's story remains disturbing precisely because it contains so many unanswered questions. How many victims were truly his? Which confessions were accurate, and which were exaggerated? Did he reveal the truth because he wanted honesty, or because he wanted to construct a terrifying final image of himself? These questions may never receive complete answers. The passage of time has removed many possibilities for investigation. Records have disappeared, witnesses have died, and physical evidence that might have existed is gone. What remains is a mixture of documented history and one man's own words. Carl Panzram wanted the world to remember him. Through his crimes and his writings, he ensured that it would. But remembering him requires more than repeating the most shocking claims. It requires separating evidence from confession, fact from uncertainty, and the identity of the criminal from the lives of those who may have suffered because of him. His victims, both confirmed and possible, must remain at the center of the story, not the mythology of the man who committed the crimes. In the end, Carl Panzram's legacy is not only the story of a violent offender. It is also a reminder of the importance of historical accuracy, the limits of what can be known, and the responsibility to approach true crime with both honesty and humanity. His life remains one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, not because every claim about him can be proven, but because the evidence that does exist reveals a man capable of extraordinary violence and a system that struggled for decades to understand and contain him.